Section 13 of The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Ferrard. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin. Chapter 7. Low Spirits, Anxiety, Grief, Dejection, Despair. Part 1. After the mind has suffered from an acute paroxysm of grief, and the cause still continues, we fall into a state of low spirits, or we may be utterly cast down and dejected. Prolonged bodily pain, if not amounting to an agony, generally leads to the same state of mind. If we expect to suffer, we are anxious. If we have no hope of relief, we despair. Persons suffering from excessive grief often seek relief by violent and almost frantic movements, as described in a former chapter. But when their suffering is somewhat mitigated, yet prolonged, they no longer wish for action, but remain motionless and passive, or may occasionally rock themselves to and fro. The circulation becomes languid, the face pale, the muscles flaccid, the eyelids droop, the head hangs on the contracted chest, the lips, cheeks, and lower jaw all sink downwards from their own weight. Hence all the features are lengthened, and the face of the person who hears bad news is said to fall. A party of natives in Tierra del Fuego endeavored to explain to us that their friend, the captain of a sealing vessel, was out of spirits, by pulling down their cheeks with both hands, so as to make their faces as long as possible. Mr. Bunnet informs me that the Australian aborigines, when out of spirits, have a chop-fallen appearance. After prolonged suffering the eyes become dull and lack expression, and are often slightly suffused with tears. The eyebrows not rarely are rendered oblique, which is due to their inner ends being raised. This produces peculiarly formed wrinkles on the forehead, which are very different from those of a simple frown, though in some cases a frown alone may be present. The corners of the mouth are drawn downwards, which is so universally recognized as a sign of being out of spirits that it is almost proverbial. The breathing becomes slow and feeble, and is often interrupted by deep sighs. As Gratiolet remarks, whenever our attention is being concentrated on any subject, we forget to breathe, and then relieve ourselves by a deep inspiration. But the sighs of a sorrowful person, owing to his slow respiration and languid circulation, are eminently characteristic. As the grief of a person in this state occasionally recurs and increases into a paroxysm, spasms affect the respiratory muscles, and he feels as if something, the so-called globus hystericus, was rising in his throat. These spasmodic movements are clearly allied to the sobbing of children, and are remnants of those severer spasms which occur when a person is said to choke from excessive grief. Obliquity of the eyebrows. 2 points alone in the above description require further elucidation, and these are very curious ones, namely, the raising of the inner ends of the eyebrows, and the drawing down of the corners of the mouth. With respect to the eyebrows, they may occasionally be seen to assume an oblique position in persons suffering from deep dejection or anxiety. For instance, I have observed this movement in a mother while speaking about her sick son, and it is sometimes excited by quite trifling or momentary causes of real or pretended distress. The eyebrows assume this position owing to the contraction of certain muscles, namely the orbiculars, corrugators, and pyramidals of the nose, which together tend to lower and contract the eyebrows. Being partially cheeked by the more powerful action of the central fascia of the frontal muscle. These latter fascia, by their contraction, raise the inner ends alone of the eyebrows, and as the corrugators at the same time draw the eyebrows together, their inner ends become puckered into a fold or lump. This fold is a highly characteristic point in the appearance of the eyebrows when rendered oblique, as the eyebrows are at the same time somewhat roughened, owing to the hairs being made to project. Dr. J. Crichton-Browne has also often noticed in melancholic patients who keep their eyebrows persistently oblique, a peculiar acute arching of the upper eyelid. A trace of this may be observed by comparing the right and left eyelids of the young man in the photograph, for he was not able to act equally on both eyebrows. This is also shown by the unequal furrows on the two sides of his forehead. The acute arching of the eyelids depends, I believe, on the inner and alone of the eyebrows being raised, for when the whole eyebrow is elevated and arched, the upper eyelid follows in a slight degree the same movement. But the most conspicuous result of the opposed contraction of the above-named muscles is exhibited by the peculiar furrows formed on the forehead. These muscles, when thus in conjoint yet opposed action, may be called, for the sake of brevity, the grief muscles. When a person elevates his eyebrows by the contraction of the whole frontal muscle, transverse wrinkles extend across the whole breadth of the forehead. But in the present case, the middle fascia alone are contracted. Consequently, transverse furrows are formed across the middle part alone of the forehead. The skin over the exterior parts of both eyebrows is at the same time drawn downwards and smoothed by the contraction of the outer portions of the orbicular muscles. The eyebrows are likewise brought together through the simultaneous contraction of the corrugators, and this latter action generates vertical furrows, separating the exterior and lower part of the skin of the forehead from the central and raised part. The union of these vertical furrows with the central and transverse furrows produces a mark on the forehead which has been compared to a horseshoe, but the furrows more strictly form three sides of a quadrangle. They are often conspicuous on the foreheads of adult or nearly adult persons, when their eyebrows are made oblique, but with young children, owing to their skin not easily wrinkling, they are rarely seen, or mere traces of them can be detected. These peculiar furrows are best represented on the forehead of a young lady who has the power in an unusual degree of voluntarily acting on the requisite muscles. As she was absorbed in the attempt whilst being photographed, her expression was not at all one of grief. I have therefore given the forehead alone on the same plate, copied from Dr. Duchenne's work. Represents on a reduced scale the face, in its natural state, of a young man who was a good actor. He is shown simulating grief, but the two eyebrows, as before remarked, are not equally acted on. That the expression is true may be inferred from the fact that out of 15 persons to whom the original photograph was shown, without any clue to what was intended being given them, 14 immediately answered despairing sorrow, suffering endurance, melancholy, and so forth. The history of Figure 5 is rather curious. I saw the photograph in a shop window, and took it to Mr. Rijlander for the sake of finding out by whom it had been made, remarking to him how pathetic the expression was. He answered, "I made it," and it was likely to be pathetic, for the boy in a few minutes burst out crying. He then showed me a photograph of the same boy in a placid state, which I have had reproduced. A trace of obliquity in the eyebrows may be detected, but this figure, as well as Figure 7, is given to show the depression of the corners of the mouth, to which subject I shall presently refer. Few persons without some practice can voluntarily act on their grief muscles, but after repeated trials a considerable number succeed, whilst others never can. The degree of obliquity in the eyebrows, whether assumed voluntarily or unconsciously, differs much in different persons. With some who apparently have unusually strong pyramidal muscles, the contraction of the central fascia of the frontal muscle, although it may be energetic, as shown by the quadrangular furrows on the forehead, does not raise the inner ends of the eyebrows, but only prevents their being so much lowered as they otherwise would have been. As far as I have been able to observe, the grief muscles are brought into action much more frequently by children and women than by men. They are rarely acted on, at least with grown-up persons, from bodily pain, but almost exclusively from mental distress. Two persons who, after some practice, succeeded in acting on their grief muscles, found by looking at a mirror that when they made their eyebrows oblique, they unintentionally, at the same time, depressed the corners of their mouths, and this is often the case when the expression is naturally assumed. The power to bring grief muscles freely into play appears to be hereditary, like almost every other human faculty. A lady belonging to a family famous for having produced an extraordinary number of great actors and actresses, and who can herself give this expression with singular precision, told Dr. Crichton-Browne that all her family had possessed the power in a remarkable degree. The same hereditary tendency is said to have extended, as I likewise hear from Dr. Browne, to the last descendant of the family, which gave rise to Sir Walter Scott's novel of Red Gauntlet, but the hero is described as contracting his forehead into a horseshoe mark from any strong emotion. I have also seen a young woman whose forehead seemed almost habitually thus contracted, independently of any emotion being at the time felt. The grief muscles are not very frequently brought into play, and as the action is often momentary, it easily escapes observation. Although the expression, when observed, is universally and instantly recognized as that of grief or anxiety, yet not one person out of 1,000, who had never studied the subject, is able to say precisely what change passes over the sufferer's face. Hence, probably, it is that this expression is not even alluded to, as far as I have noticed, in any work of fiction, with the exception of Red Gauntlet, and of one other novel; and the authoress of the latter, as I am informed, belongs to the famous family of actors just alluded to, so that her attention may have been specially called to the subject. The ancient Greek sculptors were familiar with the expression, as shown in the statues of the Laocoon and Aretino, but, as Duchenne remarks, they carried the transverse furrows across the whole breadth of the forehead, and thus committed a great anatomical mistake. This is likewise the case in some modern statues. It is, however, more probable that these wonderfully accurate observers intentionally sacrificed truth for the sake of beauty, than that they made a mistake, for rectangular furrows on the forehead would not have had a grand appearance on the marble. The expression, in its fully developed condition, is, as far as I can discover, not often represented in pictures by the old masters, no doubt owing to the same cause; but a lady who is perfectly familiar with this expression informs me that in Fra Angelico's Descent from the Cross, in Florence, it is clearly exhibited in one of the figures on the right hand, and I could add a few other instances. Dr. Crichton-Browne, at my request, closely attended to this expression in the numerous insane patients under his care in the West Riding Asylum, and he is familiar with Duchenne's photographs of the action of the grief muscles. He informs me that they may constantly be seen in energetic action in cases of melancholia, and especially of hypochondria, and that the persistent lines or furrows due to their habitual contraction are characteristic of the physiognomy of the insane belonging to these two classes. Dr. Browne carefully observed for me during a considerable period 3 cases of hypochondria in which the grief muscles were persistently contracted. In one of these, a widow aged 51 fancied that she had lost all her viscera, and that her whole body was empty. She wore an expression of great distress, and beat her semi-closed hands rhythmically together for hours. The grief muscles were permanently contracted, and the upper eyelids arched. This condition lasted for months. She then recovered, and her countenance resumed its natural expression. A second case presented nearly the same peculiarities, with the addition that the corners of the mouth were depressed. Mr. Patrick Nicol has also kindly observed for me several cases in the Sussex Lunatic Asylum, and has communicated to me full details with respect to 3 of them, but they need not here be given. From his observations on melancholic patients, Mr. Nicol concludes that the inner ends of the eyebrows are almost always more or less raised, with the wrinkles on the forehead more or less plainly marked. In the case of one young woman, these wrinkles were observed to be in constant slight play or movement. In some cases the corners of the mouth are depressed, but often only in a slight degree. Some amount of difference in the expression of the several melancholic patients could almost always be observed. The eyelids generally droop, and the skin near the outer corners and beneath them is wrinkled. The nasolabial fold, which runs from the wings of the nostrils to the corners of the mouth, and which is so conspicuous in blubbering children, is often plainly marked in these patients. Although with the insane the grief muscles often act persistently, yet in ordinary cases they are sometimes brought unconsciously into momentary action by ludicrously slight causes. A gentleman rewarded a young lady by an absurdly small present. She pretended to be offended, and as she upbraided him, her eyebrows became extremely oblique, with the forehead properly wrinkled. Another young lady and a youth, both in the highest spirits, were eagerly talking together with extraordinary rapidity, and I noticed that, as often as the young lady was beaten and could not get out her words fast enough, her eyebrows went obliquely upwards, and rectangular furrows were formed on her forehead. She thus each time hoisted a flag of distress, and this she did half a dozen times in the course of a few minutes. I made no remark on the subject, but on a subsequent occasion I asked her to act on her grief muscles. Another girl who was present, and who could do so voluntarily, showing her what was intended, she tried repeatedly but utterly failed. Yet so slight a cause of distress as not being able to talk quickly enough sufficed to bring these muscles over and over again into energetic action. The expression of grief, due to the contraction of the grief muscles, is by no means confined to Europeans, but appears to be common to all the races of mankind. I have at least received trustworthy accounts in regard to Hindus, Dangars, one of the aboriginal hill tribes of India, and therefore belonging to a quite distinct race from the Hindus, Malays, Negroes, and Australians. With respect to the latter, 2 observers answered my query in the affirmative, but entered into no details. Mr. Taplin, however, appends to my descriptive remarks the words, "This is exact." With respect to Negroes, the lady who told me of Fra Angelico's picture saw a Negro towing a boat on the Nile, and as he encountered an obstruction, she observed his grief muscles in strong action, with the middle of the forehead well wrinkled. Mr. Geach watched a Malay man in Malacca, with the corners of his mouth much depressed, the eyebrows oblique, with deep short grooves on the forehead. This expression lasted for a very short time, and Mr. Geach remarks, "It was a strange one. very much like a person about to cry at some great loss. In India, Mr. H. Erskine found that the natives were familiar with this expression, and Mr. J. Scott of the Botanic Gardens, Calcutta, has obligingly sent me a full description of 2 cases. He observed during some time, himself unseen, a very young Dangar woman from Nagpur, the wife of one of the gardeners, nursing her baby who was at the point of death, and he distinctly saw the eyebrows raised at the inner corners, the eyelids drooping, the forehead wrinkled in the middle, the mouth slightly open, with the corners much depressed. He then came from behind a screen of plants and spoke to the poor woman, who started, burst into a bitter flood of tears, and besought him to cure her baby. The second case was that of a Hindustani man, who from illness and poverty was compelled to sell his favourite goat. After receiving the money, he repeatedly looked at the money in his hand and then at the goat, as if doubting whether he would not return it. He went to the goat, which was tied up ready to be led away, and the animal reared up and licked his hands. His eyes then wavered from side to side. His mouth was partially closed, with the corners very decidedly depressed. At last the poor man seemed to make up his mind that he must part with his goat, and then, as Mr. Scott saw, the eyebrows became slightly oblique, with the characteristic puckering or swelling at the inner ends, but the wrinkles on the forehead were not present. The man stood thus for a minute, then, heaving a deep sigh, burst into tears, raised up his 2 hands, blessed the goat, turned round, and, without looking again, went away. Section 14.